And we're back for the ninth round of the POG Championships. I was with Connor. I'm now with Joe. Joe, how you doing? We've got an exciting game here.
Yeah, I'm really good. Glad to be joining in on this awesome stream. We're getting to the business end of the tournament now for the first pod. And we're going to really get to that point where, any mistake is really going to punish you and you're out of the tournament, but just one or two more wins and you can secure your place for day two, which is pretty exciting stuff, really.
Definitely. And both of these players are on winning in. They currently have a 6-2 record, and 7 wins is all you need for day two. So it's all on the line for these two players. They really are both going to be gunning for this win. We've got ADP-zation. We're currently watching an ADP-zation player, Cory, against another Eternatus VMAX deck. Obviously, the big new card from the new set. So we'll have to see. It looks like Eternatus is kicking things off.
And this is really going to be a story ongoing, I feel. There's a lot of hype around Eternatus being the new kid on the block, really, from Darkness Ablaze, the poster boy, coming up against probably the most popular deck that's sort of known and trusted. A lot of people brought ADP to the tournament just because we know how successful it can be. So it's going to be cool to see these two far off against each other. And we see the Eternatus player gets the energy drop, just grabs an Absol to try and slow down that turn 1 GX attack, make that Jirachi dig a little bit deeper. It removes those escape board outs. So a nice kind of inconspicuous play, really, not going super wide with the board, not getting Crobats down. So not amazing, but the energy attachments are still the crucial thing for the Eternatus players overall.
For sure. Both of these decks are actually really reliant on getting their early energy attachments. They both really rely on that 2 energy count, with ADP needing 2 energy for the GX attack and Eternatus VMAX needing 2 energy in general. We've got Cory going through, checking some prizes here, seeing... I saw him hover over that Birdkeeper for a little while. Obviously, with that Absol down, he's going to have to make sure he has multiple ways of dealing with retreating and that kind of thing. And we can also see that, in general, he's playing the basic energy build as opposed to the special energy build as well. So doesn't have access to things like Tag Call that some other builds have. Going for the Dedenne here, just going straight for the dig, probably looking for that water energy. That's the most important one to find on turn 1 usually.
Still plenty of dig potential left. Hitting the big charm is pretty reasonable against Eternatus as well. Makes his opponent find a lot more Zigzagoons and stuff like that to actually reach. We're going to see debating the Quick Ball versus Stellar Wish first. It's going to Quick Ball. Usually you need to find yourself a Zation because then all of your metal sources become live to then energy switch onto your ADP. He may think about using the Stellar Wish first just because he's already holding that switch and a skateboard's no longer an out before using the research.
Does
Seems
look like
pretty decent. Yeah.
Also, grabbing that Zation means he can end his turn. If he doesn't get that turn 1 GX attack, he can end his turn quite happily on the Intrepid Sword, drawing some extra cards, almost guaranteeing that turn 2 ADP GX attack as you're getting to draw an extra 3 cards rather than just passing your turn over, which is nice. Does take the Quick Ball here.
Could be a Crobat.
Yeah, I can see a Crobat here. Obviously, Dedenne. Oh, he's going for the Mawile.
Mawile's an interesting one. When your opponent didn't do too much, you could think that they're either holding on to not a lot, or they're holding on to Crobat for push potential next turn. So getting that information is no bad thing. Putting down the Zigzagoon, pretty reasonable. He didn't even look to see what else was in there, but I think I saw a research.
Yeah.
So there's a lot to do from this Professor's research here from Cory. Doesn't find the energy switch stuff, but there is still Crobat plays here.
Definitely. There is... no manual attachment in hand currently, but obviously...
Oranguru turns off the Crobat option. Maybe he's just accepting an Intrepid Sword here because he has missed pretty big here. Cory is playing 2 energy spinners as well as 2 waters. Gets a manual attachment in. Not the ideal color of the energy, though. Yeah,
definitely important, but like we say, not the color we necessarily want to see. But is able to supplement that with maybe even 2 sources just to... if this Eternatus doesn't quite get the ADP GX attack, if it's able to deal with the ADP, we have the Zation sort of ready to go, ready to start swinging, potentially from even turn 2. Oh, he's attaching to the Mawile as well.
I don't mind spreading energies here. Oh, he's thinking about not Intrepid Swording. Oh, wow. Choosing not to take any cards here is a big surprise from me. I don't mind him playing the sources this turn because he basically knew that his opponent was forced into a Professor's Research next turn, unless Crobat gets them some really wacky hands going on. So I don't mind spreading the energies out first. But not seeing the Intrepid Sword's a big deal because you need to see a lot of cards in this matchup, especially when you're not getting that GX attack straight out the gate. We're seeing a flying turn here. Crobat for a bunch of cards, a couple Zigzagoons coming down, another scoop up net. This is going to be a big, big turn. If you can deny that GX attack as Eternatus, or even get close enough. Oh my goodness, this hand is insane. So many scoop up nets. This Eternatus is going to really put a lot of pressure on here this turn.
Yeah,
it's going to be a wild dread end.
There's another one right there. All of this pre-supporter as well. There's the research. We saw a research get binned early on. We already see another research. There's definitely the potential for a KO here, which is crazy.
You can see how aggressive this list is, playing a lot of acrobikes, playing 4 capture energies as well. You can see how it gets so quickly onto the board as we're seeing those acrobikes paying dividends now. That's going to be enough for the KO with the Pokemon communication for a basic here. An absolutely epic turn. After really just having, like we said, that inconspicuous turn 1, just attach, pass, basically. You grabbed an Absol, that was it. And straight away, explosions coming out here with a monster Dread End.
And on top of that, Zacian, with the 340 HP on Eternatus, Zacian actually still has to two-shot this Eternatus, and realistically is going to be probably getting knocked out back quite consistently. So in general, it's sort of like a twofold incredibly strong turn here. Not only KOing the ADP, but also leaving Cory with basically a board that really can't deal with this ADP, this Eternatus right now at all.
A lot of the time, you try to almost have an ignore strategy as ADP. You try and get that early GX attack and just try and pick off the Crobats and the other things that are in range of your Zacian and Mawile. Sometimes you try and two-shot through one Eternatus and then boss around, but that option's sort of been taken away by the speed of this Eternatus turn 2. Really is going to be detrimental, and it's going to create some really creative plays if he's going to come back into this game, because it feels like the conventional prize race is pretty much out the window at this point.
Yeah, for sure. Looks like a boss was taken from the Stellar Wish, and it's going back on top of the deck with Primate Wisdom, attaching another energy to the Mawile. And okay, looking at maybe even switching with the Mawile.
Okay.
Obviously,
you're getting a good chunk of damage in. You're always representing that two-shot with the Mawile.
For sure. And it's also making use out of the water energy in hand that can't be used with Zacian right now. It's getting some value out of that, ready for next turn, hopefully to be able to set up for some metal sources plus attach. Pretty simple turn. In response, though, just KOing for another 2 prizes. And all of a sudden, Johnny only has 1 prize left to take to win this game, guarantee him a spot in day 2.
And there's basically nothing that can tank from the ADP player side at all. So it's hoping to try and find some more Marnie sort of disruption alongside a KO here. Hope your opponent just misses an energy drop. That's like the only thing you can hope for here. They need nothing else in this game. So really are fighting from behind at this point and really just hoping more than expecting to win at this point after the ADP went down without any value and giving up 3 prize cards.
Definitely. And that's the thing we've seen with this ADP. It's such a strong Pokemon when it gets set up, but you do have to take the time to use that GX attack. And in general, the GX attack is the crutch of the whole deck. And if you don't quite get there, it can really present some awkward options. Looks like we're going to see a Crobat here from this Quick Ball. Got the boss in hand for maybe some stall options, but in general, there's not much really that can be stalled. There's a lot of switch outs in Johnny's deck.
Marnie's interesting. I feel like if you're ever going to come back into this game, you need to try and get lucky on your end and try and get a Zacian powered up whilst also playing the Marnie. It feels like if you're playing the research here, you just leave your opponent with way too many outs just to find 1 energy drop.
I agree. In general as well, even though Marnie looks like one of the best supporters to use right here, on his bench there's only 1 Crobat. He still has 3 more Crobat that can quite easily draw him cards. So he did use the Marnie. We did see a Marnie from Cory, but in general, there's still a lot of outs. There is the Metal Patch, or the Metal Saucer, sorry, to attach to the Zacian. So we're just looking for a switch option.
Ooh, that's not live. The Absol in play means that the escape board isn't alive out here. So looks like he's not even going to be able to launch an attack this turn at all. And that just means that he's pretty much dead on board here.
It's going to be game over. The only thing that can survive a hit is this ADP.
Yeah.
Providing there's no damage modifiers. 1 last dig from Cory, using that Primate Wisdom to see if there's anything he can do. The Big Charm helps. The Big Charm actually means the ADP is a little bit stronger. But in general, the Big Charm goes straight on the Zacian. Interesting.
Kind of depends on how many Scoop Up Net have already been played. I feel like a lot were played on that second turn.
For sure.
but you need to energy switch a skateboard, retreat this Jirachi into ADP, otherwise you're just dead on board here.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's not going to do it. Jirachi is pretty fragile.
Intrepid Sword will unfortunately seal the game, as Johnny will be able to just dread end for the last prize, probably being pretty aware of the fact that there's almost nothing that can be done at this point. Obviously, Eternatus had such a strong turn two. Like you said, the turn two seemed initially not overly that impressive, or the turn one seemed not that impressive, but all of a sudden, out of nowhere, this turn two KOing an ADP with a big charm as well. It's insane how quickly and straight out of the gate this deck can come.
It was such a big statement as well. It was a really awkward situation where the Absol coming down on turn one just meant that we saw Cory have to play the switch to put the ADP into the line of fire if he did miss. And then obviously when he does miss, it means the Eternatus player is able to just capitalize massively, able to crow back into research, which just makes that 270 like completely in range, especially with those pings from the Zigzagoon throughout and those scoop up nets. You can see how a straightforward streamlined list with those acro bikes as well, especially in the pre-rotation 60s, they have so much speed and one-shot potential that's what's carried Eternatus through the tournament so far. It's been doing quite well for a number of players. And if you keep running into those ADP matchups, I don't think you're too unhappy to see them, to be honest, because you force a lot out of the ADP player, even when they do hit their GX attack. And if they don't, they're just in a horrible position.
Definitely. And with ADP being the most represented deck on day one, you're going to be pretty happy as an Eternatus player being able to see a wide variety of people playing the ADP deck and thinking, well, as long as I can keep the pressure up, maybe even like we saw there, we feigned a really fairly weak turn one, but the energy attachment was basically the only thing that mattered there. The Absol obviously really useful as well. Into such an explosive turn, it definitely makes it very, very sort of obnoxious how sort of impressive this deck can be. And like I say, when there's so many ADP-zations around, if you can do that one or two more times throughout your day, especially tomorrow, you're going to be really, really set for a pretty strong tournament, I feel.
So far on the stream, we've seen a lot of ADP coming up against all sorts of other decks, especially the two V Maxes I want to focus on, because if they don't hit every beat perfectly, the ADP player, these new V Maxes have such high hit points and such high damage caps that they get completely punished just like immediately. So if you're building ADP for this sort of format, you need to just streamline as much as possible and put as much consistency towards that turn one GX attack if you're the player going second, which means playing like acrobikes, energy switches, energy spinners, all those sorts of things. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, you're just going to be fighting from behind. It's really, really just detrimental. And it was really cool to see the Absol play there as well. It's not always like a big part player anymore now that we have scoop up nets so often in the format, but ADP is still super reliant on just their skateboards and 4 switches. So that one-off card really like completely changed the way the first 2 turns went. And at the moment, the format's in that state where the first 2 turns are the most important turns of every game of Pokemon right now.
For sure. Both of these decks rely on turn 1 energy attachment, basically. And if you can do anything to stop your opponent hitting that energy attachment, you're immediately going to gain so much tempo, such an advantage in these matchups, which is really interesting. We saw earlier on, Darren did not play the Absol, but we saw in this list that the Absol was played. And that's something that was mentioned earlier on, how versatile these Eternatus decks can be, because the 4/4 Eternatus is pretty standard, along with the 4 Crobat, and usually 3 to 4 Zigzagoon. But in general, you then have 3 or 4 slots of your favorite dark types for the meta. We saw Absol do really well there. We've seen there's 2 different Hoopers in format. We've even seen lists with things like Weavile, both the GX and the one that does more damage based on the amount of abilities on the opponent's board. So Eternatus actually has a lot of flexibility, despite being super consistent in this pre-rotation format, having the acro bikes and stuff like you say. There's 3 or 4 slots where you can just include your favorite techs for the matchups. And I think that's going to be really useful going into tomorrow, where you can change your deck lists as well, because you can see what's been doing well, what's not been doing well, what was represented, and kind of pick and choose those 3 or 4 cards based on a bit more information now.
Yeah, I think that's an underrated element of Eternatus. Everyone just says, yeah, its stats are big and dumb, and of course this is good. But the fact that we also have some nice 1 energy, 1 prize attackers that you can weave in that Yveltal GX alongside Zigzagoon. You've got a lot of creativity there as well. So if you are, missing an energy drop, you still are in good shape. And I mean, just comparing this to previous VMAXs, like look at Dragapult. We were just so happy to get a 2 energy attachment on Dragapult just to do 130 damage. Now, getting 2 energy on an Eternatus and then getting more bench is just wildly so much stronger. The high roll turns are completely insane with Eternatus, and it will just run through people. And when you play a ton of ball search cards, a ton of acrobikes, and you can play a Crobat every single turn, you're drawing a lot of cards to get you there. So yeah, very nice, streamlined, with a straightforward plan, but also with a bit of wiggle room there when things aren't going well. So I expect it to do pretty well throughout today and tomorrow.
Definitely. The other VMAX you mentioned from this set, Center Scorch, also has that real high roll potential, which is another one that we've featured a couple of times, but hopefully we'll get to see a bit more in the second pod later on and tomorrow as well. Obviously, it's a welder deck, and welder decks inherently have this kind of inconsistency sometimes, but it's actually not as reliant on welder as some other decks. With that kind of caveat of if you do hit welder, you're in such a dominant spot. You can do very similar things to what we've just seen, being able to KO an ADP on turn 2 before they've even had the opportunity to attack, along with having great typing for the Zacians as well. It's another, like you say, really, really interesting VMAX deck that, in comparison to some of the VMAXs we've had, these cards seem so strong. And like you say, the high roll potential is incredible with some of these decks.
And I think Darkness Ablaze really has sort of started to pose that question with the 2 new VMAXs as well as Vikavolt. They've said, do you want to go first or second? And you really have to analyze that very well. So I think this tournament will reward those players, even if they're piloting new archetypes, to know how they interact with all sorts of other decks as well, because it is obviously open deck list. So you have that decision available to you if you win that coin flip. Is my deck doing much better into this specific matchup going first or second? It's not always that easy. Sometimes even if you're going up against welder-based decks, you still might want to let them go second to get the welder and the Heatran and have a bunch of energy in play to give yourself potentially, like a boss's orders play to try and remove a bunch of those energies or just be the first attacker on the board. A lot of ADP variants right now, they're trying to go second to sort of hit that GX attack, but you really need to run the numbers to see how consistently you can do that compared to just guaranteeing 3 extra cards with an Intrepid Sword, getting an extra attachment in, and hoping to fight back after you've let your ADP get knocked out after a GX attack, because it's really, really rare that you're going to be able to announce Ultimate Ray in this format, it seems. The format is just way too fast right now.
Yeah, for sure. And like you say, it's a question that's kind of been a mainstay throughout the whole of the Pokemon history. Do you want to go first or second? And that really changed when Sword and Shield came out. A lot of people just sort of changed things around with the supporter change. A lot of people thinking maybe it's better to go second to now guarantee or now have access to a supporter. A lot of people still saying, I want to go first. I want to be able to evolve first. I want to be able to attach energy first. I just want that first turn tempo. But like you say, this is, I think, one of the first tournaments we're seeing where it's actually a decision again, and that decision can impact the whole game. If that decision is if you make the wrong decision at the start of the game, it can really, really hurt you, because like you say, you're constantly playing from behind at that point. And in a game, especially with a lot of 3 prize Pokemon, in a game like Pokemon that can be over so quickly, you really don't, a whole turn behind can be absolutely game changing.
There's a ton of intricacies as well. Like there's plays from the Centiskorch player where they can, just welder to an active Volk, or even just onto a Centiskorch. You can try and knock out a Jirachi turn 1. You can try and Radiating Heat away in energy from an ADP. They got an attachment in. So there's a ton of interaction from the players from like the very start of the game. So you really need to make sure that every single action on your first and second turns are like completely correct and put yourself in the best chance to win. So it's zoomed the card game in from like 8-turn games to be like, play perfectly for 3 turns and you're probably going to win. So it really just leaves no wiggle room for mistakes, or let's be fair, you don't have much wiggle room for bad draws. And I think a lot of people aren't super happy with that. But again, in the format, we have a lot of ball search, we have Crobats and Adenes, so there shouldn't really be much excuse unless you're not playing those cards.
For sure. And I think, like you say, with the whole that sort of thing sort of zooming in, it's definitely really, really interesting, because I think it creates really, really interesting games when you do get 2 players that do perform both of those 2 turns perfectly. It can create really, really interesting games, which sometimes will even extend longer than a usual game of Pokemon, because they're so back and forth and sort of bosses orders here, Marnie's there, that kind of thing, that when you see these games where someone maybe makes a slip up or misses something, we've seen a couple of times on stream today where the games are just over in 2 or 3 turns. But sometimes when players play perfectly for the first 2 turns, it can create some really, really sort of complex dynamics between the decks, like you say, as well as in the format in general.
It feels like Gust has become way more premium as well. There's so many easy prizes sat on the bench these days. I think people are just saying that I have to set up, I have to use the Dene, I have to use Crobat most of the time. We've seen some things like Dragapult previously where they would just play like Jirachis and try not to give up those easy prize cards for the opponents. But now it feels like if you just whiff on those opening turns, you lose. So you really need to just accept that you're trying to cycle through the deck as much as possible for those openings just to make it all happen. So it does mean that Boss's Orders is just that much more premium, because how many games end on a Boss's Orders for that additional prize card that you're taking? Either it's a 3-prize Pokemon that you're trying to set up a 2-shot for, or it's one of those easy 2-prize Pokemon that you can just mop up. And obviously ADP takes those additional prizes, so it's always looking to steal wins that way by flipping heads on Pokemon catchers, or using a Boss's Orders to just take one of those up and ignoring fruit like the active. So Goss has become like super duper premium. We're seeing like 4 counts of Boss and Elder Goss in lists now, just because on the turn you need it, you really need to play it. Otherwise, your window's already shut and the game's over on the opponent's side.
Definitely. I like what you said about the ADP sort of really relying and leaning into that strategy at the moment. With Crobat's release, it's another Pokemon that ADP can Ultimate Ray or use the Intrepid Sword, not Intrepid Swords, Brave Blade to be able to take 3 prizes on. And that's, again, I think one of the biggest reasons maybe why a lot of people stuck with their guns and stayed with the sort of familiar pick of ADPization today, because if anything, the strategy hasn't changed, and it's got a bit easier because people are also playing Crobat now. So there's people that were playing to Dedenne may have thrown in another Crobat to make it a lot more targets for you to search at, for you to gust up and take your prizes on. So I can see why ADPization ended up being the most popular deck in the first pod of the tournament, because the strategy hasn't changed, but in general, the win condition in some people's books has actually got easier, just because there's so much more access to these bench-sitting Pokemon that can really be capitalized by ADP and Zacian.
Yeah, I think ADP is just one of those decks that doesn't really take any hard losses, I want to say. As long as you're drawing like pretty reasonably, you're never going to be just washed out. We did see one washout game against Center Scorch, but that was some like misses here and there. So if your plan A goes well as ADP, you're basically always in the game. You're always, digging for like your last Saucer plus a boss. You're never like completely out of it. There's always going to be that one turn where either you hit or you miss. And it's just trying to work yourself in a position as often as possible to make that happen. It's been cool to see how many people have pulled the trigger on Eternatus and Center Scorch, though. It shows that people are, willing to put their eggs in sort of that sort of new, sort of unknown basket where they have not much to base it off of. There's only really been, a small Japanese online tournament in this format that we can base our decisions off of. So it's all completely their own testing. So they've put a lot of work in to make sure that they're confident with these new VMAX archetypes. And you can say that, the stats are there. It's pretty obvious that these cards are going to be strong, but finding a 60 that works for them and having enough game time against, a fairly wide field, because there's probably like 8 to 10 decks that are reasonable to bring to this tournament, that it's cool to see that those players are being rewarded for taking the risk with new stuff.
Definitely. And that's something I really like about this tournament, because that's a similarity to the usual official Pokemon World Championships. It's especially last year's, it was in a completely untested format. There was no tournaments behind it. We had a rotation, and whilst this tournament doesn't have a rotation, we don't have any tournament data to pick our decks on. So it's all based on people's testing, people's sort of theory mon, these kind of things that sometimes later on in formats get figured out and you kind of know what you're going to expect. But this tournament, we could have seen any deck from anyone, and if the testing has gone well, we could have seen anything do well. Obviously, we've seen things like Eternatus, ADPization, Vikavolt doing well that we expected to do well. But there's also a really wide variety of other decks that are still in good records, and that's all down to sort of the format of this tournament and being able to go into a tournament untested in terms of official tournaments, and basing it sort of entirely on your own testing and your own sort of theory behind decks.
Yeah, I mean, it's really cool that people have the confidence to just stick to something new and say that it's good enough for them. So it's been really nice to see a good variety. Obviously, ADP being extremely, extremely popular wasn't like too much of a surprise. Everyone already had the cards online, so that's always somewhat of a limiting factor when a tournament's so fresh out the gate. Only a handful of people would have been able to get enough codes even to build something like Eternatus. So yeah, it's cool to see that people are, you know, giving their all to try and play a new deck if they think it gives them the best chance to win. And you know, when we're playing in a tournament of, you know, a lot of people, you want to give yourself the best chance to win, obviously.
Definitely. And like you say, it's nice to see that paying off. We've had 2 Eternatus players make it into day 2 already today. There was a couple more around the winning in record a couple of rounds ago. So there's definitely an overarching theme that Eternatus wasn't, the hype behind it wasn't completely fictitious. It actually seems to have proved itself as one of these really top archetypes. Obviously, we have another pod later on and all of day 2 as well. And we'll have to see how the meta develops through both of those sort of mini tournaments. But in general, seeing some of these decks do well is really, really nice to see, especially as, like you say, people have put their time, put their money as well, getting the codes, being able to get Crobat Vs are still pretty expensive on sort of the trade area. So in general, it's nice to see the payoff when we see these players making it to day 2.
And it's kind of been touted as having a few flaws. You know, people have said like, oh, it can't beat Zamazenta, it can't beat Decidueye, it can't beat Control. But, you know, some people are finding ways around it in the first place. And some people are just saying, well, I don't expect them to be as popular as the other VMAX decks, which I can usually outtrade. And as long as I've got a good ADP, I've got a good chance of winning any matchup, really. And there's still, you know, the Vikavolt roaming around, which I feel Eternatus is pretty strong against. You can make the matchup even stronger if you start adding in, you know, high darkness energies so they can't stall stuff in the active. And you can even play some supporter cards to get around stall approaches and stuff. So I feel like Eternatus does have, like we said earlier, that sort of amount of space in the deck that you can tech for the thing that you're most concerned about. And with such a solid baseline of just saying, okay, my list starts with 4/4 Eternatus, 4 Crobat. What else do I need? It's just a really, really easy build for the first like 40 cards, and then you can get creative for what you're expecting to see. So that gives me a lot of confidence that Eternatus will sort of stick around throughout Darkness Ablaze, even if it is like public enemy #1 in the end.
Yeah, definitely. We'll have to see whether AIM will make it. We're heading into a short break now, ready for round number 10. Not too long away. That'll be the final round of Pod 1, so we'll have to see how people do. And yeah, make sure you stick around for round number 10 coming soon.